quite often there's the view that you've got to have an environment or production, and I'm a big advocate that you can happily have both.
I don't think it matters where you live, whether you live in a suburb or whatever, you will see change over a period of 40 or 50 years, which I'm looking back on, and we're seeing that here.
I'm positive that you can find a balance where you can still have productive farmland, and the important or fragile bits, that may have to be sacrificed from farmland can be saved.
The family's been here since the late 1920s. At that stage it was basically all bush, or virtually all bush. My ancestors successfully cleared it all with some government incentives, etc., as was the case at the time. Then literally in the mid-80s, I was finishing secondary school and I looked around and realised that most of our trees were literally a couple of hundred years old at the youngest, and they were dying at a rapid rate. Both from an amenity perspective and a farming perspective, trees are nice. Cattle like sitting under trees, just like people do. At that stage, our local council had a little exercise where you could get so many trees per year, and so I started off and fenced a little patch and planted some, and that was the first trees that had been planted probably ever on this farm. And it's just literally grown from there. And from that very small plot, which was about the same size as a standard house block, we're now up to well over 100 acres.
My son planted a small plot, and it was interesting to see how the stock related to that. And we then started taking up government incentives that were available to fence off streams and revegetate those. And we've tried all sorts of different autumn plantings, spring plantings, trying to work out what worked the best for us.
There used to be a very large swamp called the Greta Swamp. It was quite a sizable couple of square kilometres, and it was literally a catchment zone for the creek used to come down and deposit all the silt in that swamp. It was a very rich swamp. In the late 1890s it was actually drained under a government employment project, and this weir was actually constructed to hold the water back. There was 2 man-made channels for many kilometres to drain the swamp, and it basically acts as a Y, and this weir was put in at that junction to help direct water down one channel or the other. And in actual fact, by digging those drains, the local wells in the area dropped, apparently at the time, by 14 feet, the water levels in them. That's how much water drained out of the landscape. And it's caused enormous erosion in the creek itself, because that swamp in its natural setting acted as a sediment buffer and slowed the water down and took the energy out of it. And since that's been manually dug, the water sped up. Faster water causes more erosion, and literally the creek's just eroded away.
In the beginning it was treated as a bonanza because it was cleared land, very rich, fertile land, and everyone thought this was fantastic. It created a complete change in the area around Greta West, in the draining of the swamp. The land inside the swamp then was resurveyed, more sheep, more cattle, and it wasn't until many years later that it was realised that in many cases, especially in the hill country, that it was creating damage.
I knew there was a swamp here originally at Greta West and wanted to know more about it, and I thought it was an ideal project right in my backyard basically. So I did quite a lot of research on that and came up with a report which I was quite happy about, but got very interested as I went along and found out a lot of information on what was back then the Greta Swamp. I sort of broke it up into 3 categories, and it was a pre-European settlement, European settlement, and then there was this bit that crossed over into both the Bunyip, the Greta Swamp Bunyip. For what I believe in Aboriginal Dreamtime, there was a bunyip that lived in swamps. But there was also the stories that I found from my research about the local early Europeans that heard these noises, and they used to go out on horseback into the swamps and look for this so-called bunyip, and never really did find anything. Just the noises, but never came back with any hard evidence. I did some research on an Australian bittenbird which was predominant in swamps and would have been here at the time. It needs swamp areas and high reeds and that for habitat. It's been known to have a big vibrating loud boom at night. Very hard to find. I suppose when they drained the swamp and its habitat went, that we know the Australian bittenbird went with the habitat and moved on. And at the same time that the greater swamp bunyip, as I understand it, was heard of no more as well. So I sort of feel there may be a connection there. Revegetation can take up to 100 years in certain instances to get the right size tree with the right size hollows back in it to, put the right size critter that wants that type of habitat. So it's a long-term vision. They're things that unfortunately you can sort of knock them over pretty quick, but to get them back to where it needs to be to work back in its normal balance can take quite a while. So it's always ongoing, yeah. But it'll certainly help the habitat out for the local indigenous animals.
We're seeing a big change in the area of, when I was younger, it was very predominantly a farming area. It's now becoming more of a lifestyle area. Much of the land has been subdivided into smaller lots, right down to tiny little lots, but many of them are lifestyle these days. There's a small percentage of, I suppose, true traditional farming properties left, and that has changed the role and the atmosphere of the area.
Like most people that grow up with a great thing, we literally just took it for granted. It was literally only when you have visitors and they look at the view as we look across at the Alps and they say, oh, isn't that fantastic? You look at it and think, yeah, well, it is pretty special. But even just the whole region itself, you've got the Alps, you've got the rivers, you've got the plains, literally everything that's good about Australia is right here. So it's a pretty good place.
We've been here 10 years now and you wouldn't change it for the world.
Reeder West's always been home. Yes, rightly or wrongly, I've always thought it a beautiful spot to come back to.